Olivia Carter had always dreamed of becoming a royal guard. Ever since she was a little girl, she admired the disciplined men and women standing tall and proud outside the Grand Palace. Their uniforms were spotless, their movements sharp, and their expressions unshaken. To her, they were more than just guards. They were symbols of strength and honor. She wanted to be one of them, to wear that uniform, and to stand with pride. After years of training, Olivia finally achieved her dream. She worked hard, proving that she could handle the challenges of the job just like anyone else. Standing guard at the historic palace was not just about looking strong. It was about discipline, patience, and respect. She had been trained to remain still, no matter what happened around her. Tourists often tried to make the guards laugh or react, but they were taught never to break their stance. It was a test of focus, and Olivia was proud that she never failed. But being a royal guard wasn't always easy. Every day, hundreds of tourists visited the palace. Most of them were polite, taking photos and admiring the history. But there were always a few who saw the guards as something to mock. Olivia had seen it all. People making funny faces, waving hands close to her face, and even pretending to attack just to see if she would flinch. But she never reacted. She stood tall, just as she had been trained to do. She knew that people thought of the guards as statues, as if they weren't real people with real feelings. Sometimes she wanted to turn and tell them that standing in one position for hours wasn't easy. She wanted to remind them that she had worked hard for this position, that this wasn't just a job but a duty she took seriously. But she couldn't. Speaking or reacting would break the tradition, and Olivia wasn't about to let that happen. One day, while Olivia was on duty, she noticed a group of tourists acting differently. They were louder than usual, laughing and pointing at her. At first, she ignored them. She had seen many people behave this way, and they usually lost interest after a while. But these tourists didn't seem to be leaving. They whispered to each other, exchanged grins, and then moved closer. Olivia remained still, watching them from the corner of her eye. Something about them felt off. She could hear their laughter growing louder as they took turns posing in front of her. Some made silly gestures, while others pretended to salute her in a mocking way. Olivia stayed firm, refusing to react. But deep down, she had a bad feeling. These weren't just playful tourists. They were looking for trouble. And soon, Olivia would realize that they were about to take things much further than she had ever expected. The group of tourists stood near Olivia, still laughing and pointing at her. They seemed to enjoy testing her patience, as if trying to see how much she could take before reacting. Olivia remained still, just as she had been trained. She kept her eyes forward, not giving them any attention. But inside, she was fully aware of their every move. The leader of the group, a tall man wearing a bright jacket, smirked as he waved a hand in front of Olivia's face. He knew she wouldn't respond, and that made him bolder. The others giggled, encouraging him to keep going. "She won't move," one of them whispered, sounding almost amazed. "It's like she's a robot." Another tourist, a young woman with a camera, stepped closer. She tilted her head and examined Olivia as if she were some kind of museum display. "I wonder if they ever blink," she said. Then, without warning, she clapped her hands loudly near Olivia's ear. The sudden sound made other visitors around them gasp, but Olivia didn't even flinch. She had trained for moments like this. She knew that no matter what happened, she had to stand firm. But the group wasn't done. Seeing that their tricks weren't working, they decided to take things even further. One of them pulled out a pair of sunglasses and carefully placed them on Olivia's face. The others burst into laughter, taking pictures as if she were just a funny statue. Olivia felt the weight of the glasses on her nose, but she didn't move. She knew the palace guards were always watching from a distance, ready to step in if things got out of control. A few onlookers shook their heads, clearly uncomfortable with what was happening. One elderly couple whispered to each other, glancing at Olivia with concern. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, "Why are they bothering her?" His mother sighed and gently pulled him away, not wanting him to see any more of the disrespectful behavior. Still, the tourists didn't stop. They kept finding new ways to test Olivia. One of them pulled out a feather from a souvenir bag and pretended to tickle her hand. Another placed a small sticker on her shoulder. It was all a game to them, a way to get a reaction, to capture a moment they could laugh about later. But Olivia didn't move. She remained still, her expression unchanging. Inside, she reminded herself that this was just another test, like all the others she had faced before. She knew that if she stayed patient, the group would eventually get bored and leave. Unfortunately, they had one final trick up their sleeves, something that would cross the line completely. They weren't just looking for fun anymore. They were about to do something that would make Olivia's fellow guards step in. And this time, the consequences would be serious. The tourists were still laughing, but now they wanted to do something even bigger, something that would make their prank unforgettable. They had already tried everything to get Olivia to react, but she remained strong, standing like a statue. Instead of respecting her discipline, they took it as a challenge. One of them, a man with a backpack, whispered something to the others. They exchanged glances, then suddenly burst into laughter. "Let's see if she stays still after this," he said. He reached into his bag and pulled out a long piece of rope. At first, it seemed like a joke, but when he held it up for the others to see, they nodded excitedly. This wasn't just harmless fun anymore. They were about to cross a line. Without warning, the group moved quickly. Two of them grabbed Olivia's arms while another wrapped the rope around her waist. They tied it to a nearby pole, securing it tightly. It all happened so fast that the other tourists in the area barely had time to react. A few gasped. Some even took out their phones to record, but no one immediately stepped forward to stop them. The group stepped back and admired their work. "Now she really looks like a statue," one of them joked. They clapped and cheered as if they had accomplished something impressive. Some of them took photos, grinning as they posed next to Olivia, treating her like some kind of attraction. Olivia remained calm, but inside, her heart pounded. She had trained for many situations, but this was beyond disrespectful. Her arms were pinned, and though she could move her legs, she knew that struggling would only encourage them more. She kept her breathing steady, refusing to let fear or anger show on her face. The other visitors in the area started murmuring. Some were shocked. Others looked uncomfortable. A young woman, holding a map, turned to her friend and whispered, "Isn't this too much? They shouldn't be doing that." A man in a business suit, who had been taking a break on a nearby bench, finally stood up. "This isn't funny," he said firmly. "You need to untie her." But the group only laughed louder. "Relax, it's just a joke," one of them said. "She doesn't even care." What they didn't realize was that Olivia's fellow guards had been watching everything from a distance. They had seen it all, from the teasing to the final act of tying her up. And while royal guards were trained to stay still and ignore distractions, this time was different. This wasn't just harmless teasing. This was an insult to their duty, their discipline, and their respect for tradition. Suddenly, the air changed. The laughter of the tourists faded as they noticed movement nearby. Other guards, dressed in the same uniform as Olivia, were now approaching with firm, powerful steps. Their expressions were unreadable, but there was no doubt about one thing. This so-called joke was about to have serious consequences. The laughter of the tourists slowly faded as they began to sense that something was wrong. The mood had shifted. The playful atmosphere they had created was now heavy with tension. The reason? Olivia's fellow guards were approaching, and their steps were firm and deliberate. The group of guards moved in perfect unison, their faces unreadable, their posture strong. They didn't run. They didn't shout. But the power in their silent approach was more intimidating than any loud warning. The tourists, who had been so full of confidence just moments ago, suddenly felt uneasy. One of them, the man who had tied the rope around Olivia, gulped. Guys," he whispered, his voice no longer filled with amusement. He took a small step back, as if realizing they had gone too far. The lead guard, a tall man with sharp eyes, stopped just a few feet away. His gaze moved from Olivia, still tied to the pole, to the group responsible for this humiliation. There was no anger on his face, no words of warning, just a cold, unwavering stare that made the tourists feel smaller than ever before. A heavy silence followed. The other visitors, who had been watching from a distance, held their breath. No one dared to speak. It was as if time had frozen. Then, in a swift and controlled motion, one of the guards stepped forward and untied Olivia. The rope fell to the ground, and Olivia, still keeping her composure, adjusted her posture and stood tall once again. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence spoke louder than words. The tourists shifted nervously. One of them forced a laugh. "It was just a joke," he muttered, trying to brush it off. "We didn't mean anything bad." But the guards weren't interested in excuses. Without breaking their discipline, they signaled for security officers to station nearby. Within seconds, 2 uniformed security personnel arrived. They weren't royal guards, but their presence was just as commanding. Unlike the guards, the security officers had no reason to stay silent. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, his voice firm. A few of the bystanders stepped forward to explain. "They tied her up," an elderly woman said, shaking her head in disapproval. "It wasn't an accident. They did it for fun." The security officer's expression hardened. He turned to the tourists, who were now looking more nervous than amused. "Is this true?" he asked. The group hesitated. The leader of the tourists, the one who had first come up with the idea, glanced at his friends. He was hoping someone would defend him, but no one did. They all knew they had crossed a line. The officer sighed and pulled out a radio. "We'll need to take them in for questioning," he said. The tourists panicked. Wait. It was just a prank. We didn't mean any harm." But it was too late. The royal guards had already turned their backs, returning to their posts. Their message was clear. This was not a place for foolish games. This was a place of duty, discipline, and respect. And those who failed to understand that would have to face the consequences. The tourists stood frozen, their faces pale as reality sank in. What had started as a joke was now something serious. The royal guards had stepped back to their positions, but their silence carried more weight than any words. They had made it clear, this was not something to laugh about. The security officers, however, were not done. One of them, a man with a stern expression, pointed at the group. "You need to come with us," he said firmly. The leader of the tourists, the one who had tied Olivia, raised his hands in protest. "Come on, man. It was just for fun. We didn't mean any harm." His voice, which had been full of confidence earlier, now had a nervous edge. The officer didn't look amused. "Fun? You tied a royal guard to a pole in front of dozens of people. Do you think that's a joke?" The other visitors around them were watching, some whispering among themselves. A few even had their phones out, recording everything. The tourists noticed this and exchanged worried glances. This wasn't just about getting scolded. This was becoming public. One of the tourists, a young woman who had laughed the loudest earlier, now looked uneasy. "Look, we didn't know it was such a big deal," she muttered. "We thought it was just part of the experience." The other officer narrowed his eyes. "Part of the experience? Do you think the guards are here for your entertainment?" He pointed at Olivia, who still stood strong, her expression unreadable. "She is here to protect this place, to serve with honor. And you treated her like a prop for your amusement." The leader of the group tried to argue again, but the officer had already called for backup. Within minutes, more security personnel arrived. The tourists had no choice but to follow them, their heads hanging low. The crowd moved aside as they were led away, some people shaking their heads in disappointment. As they walked, the leader of the group whispered, "Do you think we're in serious trouble?" One of his friends, who had been silent the whole time, finally spoke. I think we already are. Meanwhile, Olivia remained at her post, as if nothing had happened. But inside, she felt something. Pride. Not for herself, but for her fellow guards. They had stood by her, proving that no one could disrespect their duty and walk away so easily. The tourists had learned an important lesson. Respect was not something to be played with. And in places where history and honor stood tall, foolish games always had consequences. The tourists were led away by the security officers, their excitement completely gone. The group that had once been laughing and making jokes now walked in silence, their heads down. They hadn't expected things to turn out like this. They thought they were just having fun, but now they realized that their actions had consequences. Inside the security office, the tourists were asked to sit down while the officers discussed the situation. The leader of the group, still trying to act confident, leaned forward. Look, we get it, okay? We messed up. But it was just a joke. We didn't mean any harm. One of the officers, a woman with sharp eyes, crossed her arms. A joke? She repeated. You tied a royal guard to a pole. You humiliated someone who was just doing her job. The leader of the group sighed. We didn't know it was such a big deal. The officer frowned. That's the problem. You thought it was okay to treat someone like that just because they didn't react. Would you have done the same thing to a police officer, a firefighter, a soldier? The tourists exchanged guilty looks. Of course, they wouldn't. The officer continued. Royal guards are not here for your entertainment. They are here to protect this historic palace and everything it represents. Their job requires discipline, respect, and patience. Do you think it's easy to stand in one place for hours, no matter what happens around you? Do you think it's easy to ignore people who mock you? The tourists had no answer. For the first time, they saw things from Olivia's perspective. Just then, another officer entered the room, holding a piece of paper. He looked at the group and said, You're lucky. The royal guards have decided not to press serious charges, but you won't be walking away without consequences. The tourists held their breath, waiting for the verdict. The officer looked at them one by one. You will each receive a fine for your actions. You will also be banned from visiting this palace again. And if any of you are caught causing trouble in other historical sites, the punishment will be more severe. The tourists let out small sighs of relief, a fine and a ban. They had expected worse. Still, the embarrassment of being publicly called out and punished was enough to make them regret their actions. One of them, the young woman who had clapped near Olivia's ear, finally spoke. Can we apologize to her? The officers looked at each other. One of them nodded. You can, but don't expect her to acknowledge you. She has a duty to remain silent. A few minutes later, the tourists were taken back to the palace entrance. Olivia was still there, standing tall, her face unreadable. The group hesitated, then spoke softly. We're sorry, the leader said. We shouldn't have done that. Olivia didn't move. She didn't blink. She remained as strong and disciplined as ever. And in that silence, the tourists understood. They had disrespected not just a person, but a symbol of honor and tradition. After the tourists were allowed to leave, they walked out of the security office with a deep sense of regret. They had been given a second chance, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a serious mistake. The reality of what they had done had finally sunk in. They had crossed a line, and the consequences, while not as severe as they had feared, still felt heavy on their hearts. As they walked away from the palace, the leader of the group spoke up. I really thought we were just having fun. But when you look at it from the outside, it wasn't funny at all, was it? His friends were quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. They had laughed at the time, thinking it was harmless, but now they understood just how wrong they had been. The apology to Olivia hadn't helped them feel any better. The royal guard's silence, her unmoving figure, had made it clear that she wasn't going to let them off easily. Her silent discipline was far more powerful than any words. One of the tourists, A young man who had been quiet throughout the whole ordeal finally spoke. "I feel really bad about what we did to her. She was just doing her job, and we treated her like she was part of some kind of joke." Another tourist nodded. "I didn't think about it like that before. I thought it was just harmless fun. But I see now, it wasn't funny at all." The group continued walking in silence for a while, each person reflecting on what had happened. They had come to the palace expecting a fun day out, but instead they had learned a lesson they wouldn't forget anytime soon. Back at the palace, Olivia had resumed her post. She had always been trained to ignore distractions, and this situation was no different. But even though she didn't show it, part of her felt a sense of pride in the way her fellow guards had handled the situation. They had acted quickly and decisively, showing that no one, no matter who they were, could disrespect their duty without facing the consequences. It wasn't about punishment, it was about respect. Respect for the job, respect for the history, and respect for each other. Olivia had always known that her role as a royal guard was more than just standing in one place. It was about being the symbol of the values that the palace represented. And she had done that with honor. As the day went on, the tourists who had caused the trouble began to disperse. Some of them were still trying to find humor in the situation, but most of them had learned something valuable. They had seen that there were lines that shouldn't be crossed, no matter how harmless a prank seemed. At the end of the day, as Olivia stood at her post, she felt that quiet pride again. She knew that her job wasn't just about protecting the palace. It was also about upholding the values that made it special. And by standing tall without a word, she had reminded those tourists of the importance of respect. And that was a lesson they would never forget. The days after the incident passed slowly for the tourists. Each of them found themselves thinking about the events of that day, reflecting on how quickly their harmless joke had turned into something much more serious. They had returned to their homes, but the lesson they had learned stayed with them, a reminder that some lines should never be crossed, no matter how innocent the intention seemed. Meanwhile, Olivia continued with her duties at the palace. Her role remained unchanged, as it always had been. She stood tall, silent, and composed, just as the royal guards before her had done for centuries. Her uniform was as crisp as ever, and her posture was flawless. The tourists had long gone, but Olivia's commitment to her job was as strong as ever. She never sought recognition or praise for what she did. For her, the reward was in the quiet pride of knowing that her work helped protect something much bigger than herself. While the tourists were not allowed to visit the palace again, the lesson they had learned was not lost on them. They had tried to take the easy path, testing the boundaries of what they could get away with. But in the end, they had realized that true respect wasn't about making jokes or pushing limits. It was about understanding the value of the people around you, especially those who served with honor. In the months that followed, some of the tourists kept in touch, often bringing up the day they had crossed paths with the royal guard. Each time they did, they spoke with newfound respect. They had learned to appreciate the dedication of the guards, not just in their uniforms, but in the way they held themselves, no matter the situation. They often shared the story of what had happened, not with shame, but as a way of telling others about the importance of respect. As for Olivia, she never spoke of the incident. Her actions, though, had made an impression that words never could. She had stood tall, silent, and unyielding, even when provoked. In doing so, she had become a symbol of something much larger than herself. She represented a tradition of honor, duty, and respect that spanned centuries. And in her silence, she had shown everyone around her that the most powerful way to teach respect was not through words or punishment, but through unwavering discipline. The tourists, who had once seen her as just a figure in a uniform, now saw her for who she truly was, an embodiment of the values they had once taken for granted. They had learned a lesson, one they wouldn't forget anytime soon. In the end, the story wasn't just about a prank gone wrong. It was about understanding the importance of respect in every aspect of life, whether it's toward those who protect history or those who share their lives with us. And as Olivia continued her quiet vigil at the palace, She knew that the lesson, though not one she could teach directly, had been learned.